Hey, I'm excited to be back 2 weeks in a row. We're going to talk about a couple of different things tonight, and I think this kind of sets the stage. We're again looking at the life of Samson. So if you want, while you're at your table, we'll kind of jump back and forth to a lot of different places. But just a reminder that story is in Judges 13. So if you want to kind of follow along occasionally there, that'll be your point of reference. Judges 13, I think, is where that starts. But we're going to be talking about a couple of things that Samson struggled with that I think we also can claim that we struggle with, and that is anger. And then we're also going to be talking about pride. So those are kind of our overarching things. But there's a couple of things that I have found interesting as I have been going through this. And tonight, if you could write it in a sentence, I'm going to try to lead us through some discussion, and hopefully this will lead into your table time. But I want us as Christian men, as vital men, to start the process of learning how to be Spirit-led, not emotion-driven. Spirit-led, not emotion-driven. Because men don't like to think of themselves as being emotional. We like to think of ourselves as strong. We like to think of ourselves as logical. We like to think about that we're thinkers. That's typically how males in general want to think of themselves. But the truth is, obviously, we are all human, and all humans are emotional. Before we start kind of setting the stage, remember that emotions are a good thing. God gave us the capacity to have emotions. It's not a liability. So just again, from the very beginning, I don't want you to think that I'm trying to turn you into Christian robots where there's no emotion shown, no anything that just straightforward. It's not a sin to feel. But where we men, again, I'm going to generalize, but I think for a lot of us at one point or another, maybe more often than what we'd like to admit, where we get into trouble, men, is where we allow these emotions to drive our actions. Because typically men generally do. We're action-oriented. The problem is that we do, and then we regret. I think we could all think of a time or two in our life where that maybe is the case. So the problem is when we let our emotions lead us to do something, often it's something that we don't want to do. Emotion-driven often leads us to an ungodly thing. Spirit-driven never does. And if you remember last week, guys, we talked and we spent some time discussing, and what the point was is that God has made us to be warriors. And because of that, all the more reason to be led by His Spirit. We need to know what and when and where and how to fight. We need to fight for what's right. Those were the things we kind of talked about last week. That's why we cannot let our emotions guide us. You know, I read a thing today, again, as I always do, it seems like something that applies, comes across my desk or computer or a devotional or something, and follow your heart. But if you read the Bible, our heart is naturally sinful, and there's nothing good about the way our heart is in its sinful nature. So following your heart is probably not the best advice, although we hear it all the time. We're going to talk about following the Spirit. Arvin, here's where I'm going to need that verse. Paul offers us a solution to this struggle, and it's going to pop up. Jot this verse down, because I think it's one that you may want to look back on, maybe study a little more in depth on your own. Galatians 5, verses 16 and 17. Here's what Paul writes. Live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the sinful nature. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They are in conflict with each other, so that you do not do what you want. So it's interesting. My question sounds great. We probably have heard that before. We maybe have heard it hundreds of times if you go to church at all or have gone for a lifetime like I have. So here's where a lot of things that just live by the Spirit. What exactly is that? That sounds good. That sounds like a good canned Christian answer. You know, if you've heard me speak before, that's one of my pet peeves is that, we've got these wonderful canned answers to give, but they really don't mean diddly squat to anybody else and sometimes not even to us. So if you ask multiple people what living in the Spirit or keeping in step with the Spirit means, you could probably get multiple answers. So I went to one of my mentors, Kevin Corver. Some of you, he's your pastor. He gave me a great word picture that really helped me kind of figure out, what does this walking with the Spirit look like for me? And he said, it's if you could picture walking hand in hand with someone like a grandfather and a grandson, we being the grandsons, someone who's bigger, stronger, and wiser. Then another picture that was painted to me that made some sense too is following the Spirit is not like following a pace car. It's more like where the Spirit is a train locomotive and He's the source of power. If you think of the Spirit like a pace car where we're just following Him around and around, it's not that. We go nowhere, we have no strength, no power unless we have coupled ourselves to the power of the Spirit. So back to our hero of last week and the next couple of weeks. Samson might have just been the original emotion-driven poster boy. If you think about when we last left Samson, he had just eaten honey out of the carcass of a lion and he was about to host this kegger. You kind of catch me up, and again, we're all sort of familiar, and if you're not overly familiar with the story, go back and reread it. I'll try to kind of modernize it a little bit and for the sake of time. So here's Samson. He's hanging out with 30 other guys, none of which are really his friends. They're Philistines. They're by nature his enemies. And he decides to make this little bet with them. He says, if you can give me the answer in 7 days, I'll give you guys 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, then you have to give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. I was telling Arvin, sometimes my image of Samson is like this, weightlifting meathead that he's just not real smart. If you think about his math right there, that's not real brilliant. He wasn't going to come out on the top end of that. But here's the riddle. We've all heard it, and we all kind of know the answer because we know the story. But the question was, out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. So for 3 days, these guys, they couldn't come up with an answer. So they got smart. They went to his fiancée and basically threatened to burn her and her household to death if she could not coax the answer out of him. She did, and Samson caved and gave the answer. In verse 19, we read, well, he kind of freaked out and he burned with anger and he killed and robbed 30 men to pay off his debt. Now here's where the story just gets kind of weird, of course, at least according to the way we live in modern times. While he was off on this killing rampage to pay the debt, his fiance's father gave his daughter to one of the other guys that was hanging out at the party, which that's just kind of weird, and in the biblical sense of giving would mean physically as well as everything else. So then when Samson learns what his father-in-law had done, he flew into another rage. Here he is, again, following his emotion rather than common sense or the Spirit. So he catches 300 foxes, ties their tails together, puts a torch in, sets them loose in their crop, and they destroy basically the economy of the Philistines. And then they, in turn, become this angry mob, which goes and burns the fiancé and the fiancé's father's house, and they die. All right, all that says some of the obvious. That being anger causes pain. Men, for a lot of us, anger is kind of our default emotion. I think we could all sort of agree with that. Sometimes we hide it, sometimes we sugarcoat it, sometimes we're pretty good at ducking it. But if the truth be known, even those of us that are mild-mannered, I think anger is probably one of the biggest things that can get us in trouble when we let it control us. Samson was mad at the world, but in reality, again, those of us looking at the picture as we do now, hundreds of years later, we know what happened to him. A lot of it was his own doing, his own fault, his own choosing. So here's one of my first questions for us. What about you? Can you relate to Samson? Do you ever find yourself getting angry at the world? Has anger, or more importantly, your ability or your lack of ability to not to be able to control it, brought you into bad situations in life? Have you ever found yourself being driven by anger rather than letting the Spirit lead you? And again, I think if we're honest, we would all be able to say that. Yes, Tom? That's right. Yep. That's right. And that's what we're talking about through this whole series is that's why I said, I'm not saying you cannot have anger. I'm not saying you cannot have emotion. The key is let the Spirit lead you. Letting the Spirit lead you, and we're going to keep hammering that. By the time I'm done, you will have that phrase close to your heart. So, here we have anger. That's one of Samson's issues, as it's probably all of ours at some point or another. But anger, gentlemen, has an equally destructive partner, that being pride. So the story continues as Samson is, again, freaking out with anger. After his fiancée and her family was all killed, he goes out and kills another bunch of Philistine men. And he vows to keep wreaking havoc on the Philistines. So as a result of this, in Judges 15:9, he decides he's going to kind of play this smart. He actually lets the Israelites capture him and then was going to have the Israelites turn himself over to the Philistines. Well, when they did turn him over to the Philistines, he broke free, and that's when he, finding the fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Again, stories we've kind of heard, stories we know a little bit. There's no doubt, and it's quite obvious to us, that it was the power of God that made this possible. All the credit of God should have gone to God for what just happened. But if you read in verse 16, Samson, with his prideful self, takes all the credit. Read with me. It says, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." So here's where the rubber meets the road. Here's where we hopefully can get real with each other as we look at this. How about us? Are we any different than Samson? If we think about all the things we say to impress people, I think we all have our own favorite jawbones that we like to sling around. I've done this. I've been there. Did you know that I know Kyle Korver personally? Have you seen my son play basketball and football and track? It goes on and on and on. Things that we can tend to be prideful about. Oh, by the way, did you know how many cars I sold? Did you know that? It just goes on and on. Of our nature is to be very prideful. So I had to ask myself, why is it that so many of us battle pride? Why is that sort of ingrained or seem to be ingrained in particularly men? Pride, gentlemen, this is not rocket science. Pride is always born out of our insecurities. When we don't know who we are in Christ, when we lose sight of Jesus, it's interesting when you know, the classic Peter walking on water toward Christ. When he takes his eyes off of Jesus, that's when things go south for him. We use pride to try to fill that void. Pride takes over. Many of us define ourselves by our accomplishments. I think we would probably agree with it. We find, here's a great phrase. I don't know if it's great because it's sort of sad, but it's a true statement. We find our worth in what we've done instead of in whom we belong. So this is not on your questions. Grab that sheet and write this down because this may be a secondary question. What does it mean to you guys when you say you belong to Jesus? And again, I'm gonna push. I hope you allow me to push because I'm not at your tables, but don't give the canned answers, fellas. What does that really mean? My classic is if you were sitting across the table from somebody that was not a believer, that didn't have all the fluffy verbiage that we all like to use, that we hear in church, what does that mean when you say, I belong to Jesus? What does that mean to you? It goes right back to what Kyle, with his teaching, was trying to get us to really dig and look into our own hearts what that means. So let's kind of pull some of these things together. Why do we sometimes seem to prefer to rely on our emotions rather than trusting God and following the leading of His Spirit? Why do we follow and allow pride and anger? Here's what the author of the book Fight came up with, and I think he's spot on. Gentlemen, I think because deep down most of us want to be the hero of the story. We want to be the main character. We want to be the man. We want to be what the story centers around. We want everything to be about us. And that's the problem. Because God is always going to be the main character of every one of our stories. So here's what I would encourage you to do. As you move from tonight, or even at your table, but certainly in your quiet time after tonight, take a look at your life. Or maybe better yet, I challenge you to ask those that you live with or that you work with or that you have good, close community with. Where in your life have you put yourself as the main character instead of God? That's a tough one, because it's a lot more than I think I know I want to admit. Where do I refuse to trust God, relying on your or my own power and abilities? Gentlemen, are we willing to sacrifice our emotions at the altar, at the cross, committing them to God? It's then and only then that we can make Him the main character of our story. Yep, Thomas, the rest of us, you will still have your emotions, but they won't drive you. You'll be able to enter into the freedom that comes only from being led by the Spirit of God. So here's where this is the most important part of what I'm talking about. Guys, we're not talking about behavior modification. Anger and pride are just outward signs of a heart issue. And we don't have to stop with anger and pride. But since we're there, those seem to be too prevalent. We're not talking about behavior modification. Guys, we've talked a lot about why is it that we seem to kind of keep going back over the same issues. Maybe you've had the question, why is it that I continue to struggle with the same things? I'm going to suggest we need to look at our hearts. It's more than just doing better. It's more than just trying harder. It's more than becoming legalistic because if I just do the right things. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I get tired of the fight to do better. When you talk about just doing better, it became very real to me again, and I hope to impress upon you. I know in my heart of hearts that I need the power of the Spirit to change my heart. Write this verse down. It's another one I want you to look up on your own, and I want you to really study it. Ezekiel 36:26. Not a book of the Bible that I go to a lot, but listen to this. Ezekiel 36:26. It says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and will give you a heart of flesh. So if you listen to what we talk of, if we go back to the book of Galatians, really my big struggle, my big question, the $60,000 question really is, how do you walk by the Spirit? Seems like that's the advice we're getting from the Word. Seems like that's what Scripture is telling us. You know what? All of us have probably at one point or another heard a minister say, let the Spirit lead you. Or allow the Spirit to control you. And have gone away puzzled as to what was that? What does that really mean? I know I have. I don't know about the rest of you. It sounds good. What does that mean? I don't want you to go away from here tonight going, yep, Vande Lune's theme was we got to be led by the Spirit. I have no idea what that means, but we're going to go out and we're going to be led by the Spirit. We need to dig a little deeper into that. And I ran across something that just really hit home with me. It's a simple start to what it means by allowing the Spirit to control me, to control you. Jot this down if you want. You walk by the Spirit when your heart is resting in the promises of God. I'll say that again. You walk by the Spirit when your heart is resting in the promises of God. Guys, it's a way to live. It's not a 3-step process. I do this, this, and this, and this, and now I'm going to be you can really see I'm walking by the Spirit now. It's resting in those promises. The Spirit will work the miracle of renewal in your life when you start meditating on His promises day and night and then resting on them. That's why we keep talking in every ministry you know, every time you probably have got. That's why getting into the Word is so critical. Because that's where you can get to where those are in your heart. Like it says in Ezekiel, you'll get a new heart, and that's what you go to when you have tragedy, as Mike just got to experience with a family. That's why when you have questions, when you have anger, when you feel pride, those are the things that out of the heart, out of the overflow of the heart, gentlemen. So if you remember the picture of the grandson walking hand in hand with his grandfather, you and I listening to, trusting someone stronger, bigger, wiser. So here comes the question that isn't going to surprise you. It was a hard one for me to answer, and I wrote it. Brian, Scott, Mike, John, the rest of you, do you want to be a different man? Do you want to be able to control anger and pride? Are you tired of fighting the same battles over and over? And remember, gentlemen, we're in a fight. We talked about that a lot last. Whether you like it or not, the devil and his principalities, they're in a battle to kill us and everything we stand for. If those are yes, that you answer to those questions, gentlemen, we have to understand and begin to live by the Spirit. We have to be able to rest on the promises of God. So here's where we need to end. What does that mean to you? What promises do you cling to? When push comes to shove, when your life is up against it, when you have choices to make to do things that you know would be emotion driven, what do you go to? What is your go-to? Maybe even more basic than that. Have you ever truly asked the Holy Spirit into your life? I know that when you say yes to Jesus, that is part of what happens. But do you ask Him to kindle the fire, to bring wisdom? Are you inviting Him into your life? It's about a relationship. We talk a lot about a relationship with Jesus. We talk a lot about a relationship with the Father. Here's an interesting one, and maybe one that we can kind of end on. When you sense His promptings, if you have a relationship, do you just walk away? I don't know how it goes with you and your wife or you and your parent or whatever that situation that somebody really, if they've got something to say to you and I just walk away, that doesn't go so well in the Vande Lune household. But I think a lot of us hear the promptings of the Spirit, and because maybe it's our hearts are hard, maybe there's a lot of different things, but I just feel and sense that that's an area that we can maybe get on top of some of these things that we have struggled with as men.